Welcome back to Straight Talk with Dr. Brian Hartley and myself. We are excited to be here. I just rushed in from a SLIAC meeting. Actually, I chair the President's Council of our athletic conference, and we were one of six Division III colleges who had their full seasons through the pandemic because of the teamwork of that group. And so I'm very proud of that group, as well as just, being proud about student athletes in general. I think I said last week I was a student athlete, kind of came to Greenville for those reasons, but realized that it was much more than just athletics. However, that was a big part of my student experience. I met my husband there, playing volleyball. He was on the men's team and I was on the women's team, and we went club tournaments. I ran track. And so it was a big part of my student experience. But I also realized that, also very important, the holistic view of education. And so that became more and more important as I went through my 4 years at Greenville. So that's kind of my student experience. And so I just was curious, Brian, what's your student experience? So what was it like? I mean, it was a little bit before mine,
A little bit before you. I have not an athletic bone in my body, Suzanne. So I was not a part of that insider jock culture that we sometimes refer to. Instead, as I said last week, I unloaded my drums and my books. And so I found myself involved in the music scene. This was in the pre-contemporary Christian music days, but early on there in the 70s, as groups began to come through. And then I got involved in student government. And that really was the place where I began to learn more about the then college, now university. And it was a time of presidential transition. So it was a great learning experience. But no, I was never to be found on the volleyball court. I usually had my drum set at basketball games up as far as you could go in the rafters, playing away, just observing all of you who had that great athletic expertise down on the court.
So I won't do stereotypes, but it does sound like we had a little bit different student experience. But I did hear that we are similar in terms of we were both pranksters a little bit in college. So that we have in common.
That's true, but we certainly don't want to go there today.
No, we should not do that today. However, I think we both married up, because my husband was also an athlete. He played volleyball, but I think Darlene.
Yeah, Darlene was in the class ahead of me and was the chaplain of her class. She was known as a very spiritual young woman, unlike either of us, probably.
Yeah. But you came from a church background.
I did. And I, was feeling a call to ministry. And so that was very much a part, I think, of the attraction in this young woman who was very much on fire for Jesus and had already sketched out a place of leadership for herself.
Yeah, and that's how Phil was. I was kind of the opposite. I mean, I was a little bit of a wild child coming in, but like I said, an entire transformative experience I've had at Greenville, and just been chasing after Jesus ever since, and trying to do my best. But today we're going to talk about not just our student experience, but it's a little bit different perspective when we come to it from a position of leadership. It's sometimes surreal to me to even think about this institution where we serve, and many have gone before us for over 130 years, or going on 130 years this fall. And so, as you look at it from the perspective as being the chief academic officer now, years after you were a student, I'm just curious, what are some of the lessons that you've learned over the years? And now being in leadership, and now I guess transitioning out of leadership to retirement, what are the top three things that you think were challenges or opportunities or lessons learned in leadership?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because the very first position I had in student government was treasurer of the student body. And that got me springboarded the next year into student body president. And so Lynn Keeler, who was the then CFO, had to train me on what a paper spreadsheet was. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand really how budgets went outside of budgeting my own checkbook. And so I would say one of the major things that I've learned is in reference to that comment you and I oftentimes hear, no margin, no mission. So as you know, Suzanne, I've committed myself to the mission now for 45 years, the last 29 years in employment here, writing many of the sections for our accreditation report on mission. I'm committed to the mission. What I didn't understand was how important money was in terms of getting the work done. And so I think you and I have both experienced high times and low times there. And so as a student, certainly you're not paying that much attention to those kinds of things. It's not a center of your universe. But as you move into the faculty and then certainly into administration, you come to understand just how crucial it is to be able to have the resources necessary to do the work that's there. I remember the late Dr. Robert E. Ish Smith talking about when he became a president, and even though he had been here on staff for a couple of decades, walking into the presidency and hearing from a local bank person that first summer, there were things he learned then. So I think both of us have certainly learned the importance of no margin, no mission.
Yeah, I think, as a faculty member myself, it wasn't as clear as well. And I think a lot of times, no matter our discipline, we kind of build what we want to do and then hope the enrollment and advancement dollars come in to supplement that. Whereas as president now, I think more about, okay, what kind of enrollment and advancement and other alternative revenue sources do we have? This is the budget now that we can spend. I mean, this isn't rocket science, but now this is the budget we can spend. And then we offer just a great student experience around those parameters. So kind of setting the sandbox and the parameters in a different way, and then showing that we can, work within those parameters to carry out our mission. So it's a little bit different paradigm for sure, as we look at it from an administrative standpoint, as opposed to faculty or coaching. And I've done both of those things as well. So yes, very different from a student perspective, and obviously a little bit different as you even move into administration. So that's a good one. What else, what else have you learned?
Well, the second one that strikes me, and you and I were talking about our student days, is the way you think about time as a student. You parcel up the day, you think about the classes that you're in. I think you and I had a slightly different approach to this. I always tried to take those early morning classes so I could have the afternoons to get some work done. But you think about that, and then as a faculty member, obviously you're thinking about the academic term, right? And you divide that. You have the fall semester, our interterm, the spring semester, but you think in terms of academic years. And suddenly when you get into an administrative role, you realize how quickly the clock is ticking. And so I know that we've had to make some crucial decisions, particularly during COVID. It's a very short period of time. You'll remember that March 2020, when essentially we decided during spring break what we were going to do. And then that following summer, we had to decide, is there a way we can come back together? Because most schools were choosing to go online. And so how quickly we had to move, Suzanne, and make decisions. Faculty were not here during the summer. We could talk to a few of the representatives, but the clock ticks very quickly. And so I think there's a different concept of time when you're working from an administrative side than either from a student or a faculty side.
True. I mean, that's one of the things that I really take away. And Dynamic Campus, our partner with IT, has helped us work through, because we have all these systems across higher education that are in the background. People don't really think about, a CRM, like how we're talking with our prospective students, and then the back end of how you register for classes called Genzabar, like all of these programs that have to mesh together to get you the data you even need to make informed decisions. And then, as you said, making those decisions at a much faster pace than we used to. So I now have a screen in my office that comes up with all this data in real time, because if it's old, it doesn't even matter anymore. It's unbelievable how quickly data is irrelevant, and you have to just keep seeing that daily, weekly, in some cases hourly. It seemed like with COVID, so much of that, was instant contact tracing and things that we had to be aware of on campus. And so I agree with you. The pace of decision making is very real in higher ed today. And I think that having the data available which, like I said, our partners at Dynamic Campus have helped us with, is really important. So yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, anything else that you feel like you've really learned as CAO during this time?
Well, as I mentioned to you and members of the board, there was a little bit of a closing of the circle this past May, that in my last commencement, I reflected back to the fact that the first commencement I had participated actively in was 45 years previous, when I had been student body president and led the procession in. And then here this last time, here I was with you at the end of the procession, right? And 45 years later. And part of that got me thinking about everything that had transpired in between. And I mentioned last week, this sense of calling, this sense of vocation. I think that when you're a student, you come here, and our students particularly right now are very much driven by the marketplace. What's the job I can get with this? And yet we know, all the futurists are telling us that these students are probably going to go through roughly a half a dozen major shifts in their career, not just different jobs, but maybe an entirely different kind of thing that they have to get prepped for. And so as I reflected on those 45 years, I thought about the fact that Greenville really began to provide for me a sense of vocation. I could not have known that May of 1977, as I led that procession, all that the Lord would have in store for me. But as I've come, particularly through the CAO role, a role, as you know, I didn't particularly find myself candidating for, it was just this sense of joy, not necessarily a sense of happiness always. We had some rough goes, but a sense of joy. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which, by the way, is about the story of the loss of his wife, Joy Davidman, much like your experience when you were a student. And so we discovered joy as we learned to lean on Jesus and follow him in the way of the cross. And so I especially learned that the last 5 or 6 years. But as I said, 45 years really provides you with an arc to think about how God has been at work in ways that we can't even imagine.
It's so true. I love that book, by the way. You know, I think that's what we're doing for our students with experiential learning. And of course, the focus with experiential learning being on this sense of how do you work with the talents, the unique abilities and skills that you have, not just for a job, but in collaboration with a team and with others, and how that set of talent or that set of skills is, yes, it's valuable for a job, but it actually takes you or leads you to meaningful work. And so we're getting much more intentional about that into the future, even taking our students to Washington, D.C. on a trip this fall and spring. So this is, you know, new in our curriculum, not just now, you know, the St. Louis and Chicago trip that we talked about last week, but to actually get them to think about all the various things that, you know, you can do as meaningful work, and how your interests, whether it's athletics or music or whatever you might, you know, have come to be, you know, interested in, how those things might impact your vocation and calling in a much more meaningful way. As you said, I never thought I'd be in academic administration. I mean, some people out there probably think, wow, she's the president, if they knew me in college, but you know, it's even though there were really trying times over the past few years, obviously so with COVID, it's just such depth of calling and purpose that we're finding in these times, and joy much more than just, you know, surface level happiness is what really makes the difference. And so, you know, that kind of brings me to the action plan that I've talked to the audience about in our last set of Straight Talks. So you can go back and you can look at those. You can always watch those videos and ask questions, because we did talk about the focus on experiential learning, immersive experiential learning that leads to this sense of calling, vocation, meaningful work. We talked about the innovation that we've experienced on this campus, and outside the box thinking. And then, you know, we really talked about the interconnectedness of the action plan, which is, you know, if you can do this in partnership with others, with the town, with the USAG for gymnastics, with the nursing partnership with St. John's. There's so many ways that you can interconnect. And I think that also helps you discover your real potential. So anyway, you can always look back at those things. And we talked about the Free Methodist connection, as well as some of the financial wins and successes we've had over the past few years. But one thing's for sure, Brian, like, it is just a pleasure to serve Greenville University during this time and alongside you for the past few years.
And the same here, Madam President. It's a pleasure to serve alongside you in common service to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Thanks.